Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Cully Foster. I have the honor of being the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Thank you for coming here tonight. This is a timely and important discussion on the thaw in US-Cuban relations. Although I'm not sure in terms of thaw how long it's going to last, because with temperatures like we've got, they're the same way in Havana tonight. But it was wonderful to see the coverage yesterday of the Cuban flag being raised on their own embassy here in Washington, D.C. On January 3rd, 1961, Dwight Eisenhower closed the American embassy in Havana, Cuba, severing diplomatic ties with a Caribbean island nation. Of course, that Caribbean island nation had been tense since Fidel Castro overthrew the regime of Batista in '59. A limited trade embargo was instituted against Cuba in the fall of 1960, with the full embargo being passed in 1962. Over 5 decades after the severing of ties, the Cuban flag was raised above the Cuban embassy in Washington yesterday. The U.S. flag will be raised in Havana on August 14th by Secretary Kerry. While many applaud the renewing of relations, what does a revival actually mean? Much of the initial trade embargo is still intact, and there remains distinct ideological differences. While seen as a milestone, what's seen as a milestone is the renewal of relations. What impact will this have for the average American or the average Cuban? This evening's panel will seek to answer these questions, as well as explore the positions of those who are for and those who are against the normalization of relations. Joining us this evening is Sarah Stevens, the Executive Director of Center for Democracies in the Americas. She previously worked at the Center for International Policy, where she founded the Freedom to Travel to Cuba campaign. She has led several delegations to different countries in the Americas to spur further research on the region. She's also testified in Congress to the Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee in the House on National Security and Foreign Affairs regarding national security implications of U.S. policy towards Cuba. Ambassador Otto Reich is now president of Otto Reich Associates. Ambassador Reich served as U.S. ambassador to Venezuela in the 1980s and was appointed by Ronald Reagan to serve as the alternate representative to the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva. In 2001, he was appointed by President George Bush to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and later served as President Bush's special envoy for the Western Hemisphere Initiative. Peter Hakim is the President Emeritus and a Senior Fellow at the Washington Inter-American Dialogue. Prior to joining the dialogue, Mr. Hakim was a Vice President of the Inter-American Foundation and also worked for the Ford Foundation in New York, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Peru. He has served on boards and advisory committees for the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Partners for Democratic Change, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Moderating tonight's panel is Senora Maria Peña, Washington correspondent for Impremedia, the largest Spanish language publication group in the United States. Senora Peña has been a journalist for over 25 years, working for both domestic and international news agencies, including Univision, Telemundo, CBS, UPI, FA News Services. She has interviewed President Barack Obama twice, as well as many other foreign dignitaries.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I know it's hot and humid, but we promise we'll make it engaging for you, and hopefully we'll learn from you as well as you learn from us. As Tony has said, now the US and Cuba have finally decided to hit the reset button. So we'll explore tonight what this means for the average American, for the average Cuban, and what does it mean going forward in US-Cuba relations. Yesterday I got the chance to cover the reopening of the embassy, the Cuban embassy. And you could feel the energy. There was a lot of excitement. Obviously, there were also some protesters with, legitimate claims and concerns about what this means for the island. Many of them have families in the island, so that they're following this closely. But it was just really amazing to witness firsthand such a historic event. So this is a very timely panel, for sure. Here we are 54 years later. President Obama was not even born yet. I mean, think about this. He wasn't even born yet when the U.S. government severed relations with Havana. And he decided when he came into office in 2009 that he was going to try a different approach in his foreign policy affairs by engaging with adversaries. And as it looks like he's following through on that promise. So he, in 2009, he began loosening the travel and remittances restrictions to Cuba. He furthered those lifting of those restrictions in 2011. And then, of course, as you know, on December 17th, 2014, he announced a historic agreement to try to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba. And the objective, of course, is to get to a full reestablishing and normalization of relations. The opening of the embassy is just one small step, but it's a very significant step. And so tonight we're going to explore what it means for the average American. There's a lot of confusion about what this means. Right now, for sure, you can bet that Americans in general are not allowed to travel to Cuba. You need to fall into those 12 categories, and Sarah will talk about that in a little bit. So you do need to fall into those categories to be allowed to travel to Cuba. And so the argument goes, well, if Americans right now can travel, you can purchase a ticket and travel to China, a communist regime as well. You can travel to Vietnam. And, there's no problem there. And yet 90 miles away, our neighbor in the Caribbean, we're not allowed as Americans. And so there's a lot of issues that are going to pop up in the near future as a dialogue continues, for instance, on immigration. So I've talked about the timeline. Yesterday at the news conference, there was a historic news conference between Secretary of State John Kerry, and the Foreign Minister of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez. It was a historic meeting because no Cuban foreign minister has set foot on the U.S. Capitol since 1958. Many of us probably weren't born there yet, and so that was historic. What was specifically important about that joint conference they had over at State is that they both acknowledged that this is going to be a very long and complex road ahead. And there are a lot of hurdles, a lot of obstacles to overcome, because you have to start building and generating trust among two former enemies, quote unquote. So we're going to talk about what those hurdles are in a little bit. And you could also say that when you look at U.S. involvement in the Americas, what's happened throughout much of the Cold War was that bilateral relations with Cuba really centered on this issue of the trade embargo. The stated goals for the embargo were, of course, a way to bring about diplomatic change, democratic change in Cuba. And the Cuban government would argue, well, it has had a different effect on the Cuban people. So Obama comes into office saying, I'm going to try something new, okay? It's clear the embargo has not worked. The Cuban regime has used it to its purposes, has used it as an excuse to repress dissidents. And so the argument goes that, well, let's try something new. Let's see if maybe having a different engagement, direct engagement with the Cuban people brings about that change. Pretty much like what happened in the former Soviet Union. So what's happening now is that people that are opposed to this new approach, which includes most Republicans and some Democrats, they're saying, well, wait a minute. The U.S. basically gave away everything with nothing in return. What has Cuba done? What has Cuba committed to in exchange for all these unilateral concessions? And so they disagree. So you have Republican congressmen right now that are pledging to block funding for the new American embassy, which will be, it's already up and running, and the secretary will travel to Cuba on August 14th to raise the American flag. So they've vowed to block funding for that. They've also vowed to block the nomination of the next American ambassador in Havana, whoever that may be. Right now we have the Charge d'Affaires, Jeffrey De Laurentiis. He's well liked by the administration, so we'll see if he stays on. But we have that hurdle immediately. And then, of course, like I said before, people who want to try the new engagement approach are saying, well, let's try something new. So we're hoping that you get a lot about what's going to happen in the next couple of months in terms of trade, in terms of travel, people-to-people contact, what's going to happen with the immigration talks, for instance. I did a story this week where there are about 3,500, I believe, or 35,000, I can't recall right now, Cubans that are facing deportation orders. A lot of them have had criminal records.
35,000.
Yeah. Thank you. And so they're facing deportation orders. Under a 1984 agreement, the Cuban government can decide which Cubans it allows back in, as part of the repatriation agreement. There are other issues in terms of immigration. Will the U.S. get rid of the Cuban Adjustment Act? Some say it has unfairly given preferential treatment to Cubans who set foot on U.S. soil, under the wet foot, dry foot policy. For now, there is absolutely no plan to change that. So that's another hurdle on the Cuban side. So we'll keep talking about all these issues. So for now, let's get the ball going. So I wanted to ask you guys, this is historic. It's a first step towards normalizing relations down the road. What effects are we expected to see on the ground for the average American and the average Cuban? Anybody?
I'll be happy to say that I think that the average American won't feel this at all, frankly. That it's going to take many, many years before any of this, and Cuba's a tiny country with 11 million people. Its economy is even smaller than that 11 million. There will be some trade, some industries will benefit. Cuban Americans will be able to travel more easily, and there'll be a primary take advantage of this. There will be more tourism, there will be more interaction. There was an awful lot of interaction between Cuba and the United States before the embargo, before the breaking of relations, and we might return to that. But, the U.S. is an enormous country with an enormous economy and so the impact on individuals will not be terribly great here. Cuba will be a different story, but that depends on whether the Cubans take advantage of the opening and begin to open their economy and politics. Because without that, there won't be. And those are decisions that the Cubans are going to have to make. And so far, they've not shown a whole lot of willingness to sort of take advantage of the opportunity being presented. And the leadership now talks about making adjustments, modernizing, bringing the country up to date rather than sort of reform, transition, opening. So for now, we're seeing a lot of change. This is very dramatic. I agree. It's historic. Changes two countries that have been hostile to one another for so long. The changes so far have been mainly symbolic, not totally. But they should open the way. Let me say that I think 90% of diplomacy are symbols in any event, so it's not surprising. And I think 6 months is a very short period when we're talking about 50 years before that. 6 months, it's hard to. I mean, we were in Iraq for 10 years and within the military, and we hardly changed very much. One should not expect very much in 6 months, and like I say, it's going to be an interplay between the two countries, what happens, and particularly what the Cubans and the Cuban leadership decide is going to be the main impact on that country. They may have more options now because of the opening, but it's going to be up to the Cubans to decide whether they can really take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me just start from the beginning, because actually I was born before U.S. history began. The U.S. history began, as you know, the day that Barack Obama was born. He mentions in every speech, I wasn't even born yet, and you repeated that. There's a great danger in ignoring history. And in fact, a lot of the things that have been said about Cuba, even today, and certainly up to the run-up of the events yesterday, are so far removed from reality that they have to be corrected. So I guess if I do nothing else today, I hope to burst the bubble of some of the things that people think may have happened or may have led to the breaking of relations. President Obama, when he announced the resumption of relations, mentioned President Eisenhower, and frankly gave the impression, and you can read the speech, I've read it over and over, that the breaking of relations was just the unilateral decision of the United States. It was a reaction to a concerted policy by Fidel Castro to drive the American embassy out of Havana. A whole series of actions, including finally reducing the personnel to, I believe, 11. I mean, I've run embassies. I had 300 people in Caracas, Venezuela in the 1980s. Cuba, I don't remember exactly how many it was, but it's a huge embassy. I was in it when I was a boy because I had to go there to get my visa. By the way, I was born in Cuba. I was a Cuban citizen. I became an American citizen after we got our visas. We left. We came to the United States in 1960. The break was not the fault of the United States. And if anybody wants to discuss that and you got several hours, I'm happy to do that. The break was a decision by Fidel Castro to break with the United States and to embrace the Soviet Union and communist ideology. And that's, there are plenty of books and plenty of experts and eyewitnesses that I can introduce you to prove that. So we should not act, frankly, in the way that President Obama has acted up to now, which is almost in an apologetic manner. His policy of reaching out, you say, to our adversaries may very well work. We don't know. But the fact is that in nearly 7 years in office, he doesn't have a single foreign policy success to his name, and perhaps that is the reason. You talked about the reset. You said the US and Cuba have finally decided to press the reset button. That's exactly the language that was used in 2009, the first year of the administration with Russia. And look what it has gotten us. Russia has annexed Crimea, invaded Ukraine, is threatening the Baltic states, and it is a force for destruction and destabilization in Europe. That, in my opinion, is a direct result of, quote, pressing the reset button without knowing what you are doing. The Cuba agreement can be, in my opinion, can be likened to the Russia reset. And so I'm glad you asked, you use those terms. And I'm happy, I hope you'll get into the details in this conversation about why I think that. I think what the president has done is, with his action is to enable the Castro family, which has been running Cuba for the last 55 years. There is no government. The Castro family, Fidel, until he finally got sick about 10 years ago, now Raul, and Raul is grooming his son, Alejandro Castro Espin, and his son-in-law, General Lopez, compound name that escapes me, but the family is going to continue to run the country as they have run it the last 55 years. There was a possibility that with a different U.S. approach, and I'm not saying don't do anything, with a different U.S. approach, the family could have been persuaded, perhaps, to take a lot of their holdings, and by the way, they own the country. The military runs all of Cuba's industries, especially the tourist industries, and it's run, by the way, by Raul's son-in-law, General Lopez, that I just mentioned. So, this, in my opinion,
What's wrong
this
with
is a
trying to
mistake.
change? What's wrong with trying to change if changing from without through the embargo hasn't worked? What's
Well,
wrong with
okay,
trying to
okay,
change it
tell
from
me-
within?
Okay, but you know, the embargo hasn't worked. That's another mantra. Actually, the embargo is symbolic. You know, as Peter said, there's a lot of symbolism. The United States is the single largest provider of foodstuffs to Cuba. What embargo are we talking about? And has been for 15 years. So please tell me what embargo. Now, Cuba cannot ship goods to the United States because, for one thing, Cuba hardly produces anything. Cuba is the single largest debtor per capita in the world. They owe more money to more countries than anyone. Russia has just forgiven over $20 billion of debt that they owed to the former Soviet Union, which is, by the way, a fraction. And let me say that when people say the embargo doesn't work, the embargo, when it was established in 1962, contributed a great deal to bankrupting the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union contributed over $5 billion a year to Cuba for 30 years. That $150 billion, and we're talking $60, $70, 1960, 1970, et cetera, it contributed to the bankruptcy of the Soviet Union, which was, by the way, a strategy. Just like Fidel Castro had a strategy to break with the United States, Ronald Reagan had a strategy to bankrupt the Soviet Union, and it worked. And that's what brought down the Soviet Union. So, I mean, I will defend the fact that the embargo did have an effect. For one thing, when the embargo was established, and by the way, it was established because, again, Castro consciously confiscated the properties not only of Americans, but everybody on the island, especially, of course, Cubans, without compensation. A government has the right to confiscate property. We call it eminent domain in the United States. But a government has a responsibility to compensate fairly the owners. He didn't do that. He couldn't care less. I mean, you have to understand a little bit also about the history of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was a member of an armed gang at the university. He shot people. That's his background. And that's how he gained power, and that's how he holds power to this day. Actually, his brother now holds power to this day. So the embargo enabled the other countries in the region to defend themselves against the armed incursions by Castro that started in the very first year. Dominican Republic within 6 months, Panama in November of '59, and I mean you just go on. Again, the break in relations with Cuba was not a decision, certainly not a decision without a lot of thinking on the part of the United States.
Sarah, do you want to counter any of the points the ambassador just made?
I don't know. How much time do I get? First of all, I think that we are tremendously fortunate to have Ambassador Reich here in the room being part of this conversation, because it is, I believe, very important to understand the context and understand the history. And I may not agree with everything that came out of your mouth, but I think it would be silly to have this conversation without that context. I really appreciate it, and I want to add that part of what makes my job exciting and challenging is I'm not Cuban. I have no relatives in Cuba. I got into this accidentally, and it's been very important to me to have people, Cuban Americans and Cubans in Cuba, educating me and helping me understand what this history has meant to them so that I can better understand the importance of my work. And just to add to that, Peter's wife, can I tell them this?
No,
Okay, I'm going to
that's a
anyway.
private,
Okay, never mind.
no, you can't.
Is Cuban American and has helped me very much understand better the perspective from a Cuban who lives in the United States. All of that said, I've been working on Cuba for 15 years. I travel there a lot. I go to Cuba with mostly leading delegations of members of Congress. More recently, since December 17th, also leading business trade missions. There are a lot of US companies very, very interested in getting involved in Cuba. And I spend most of my time looking forward and trying to understand where we are now and what comes next, and how to best support and encourage a positive outcome. Back to the beginning, the question you asked was about how this impacts Americans. I think it's a really good question because actually, I agree with Peter, not all that much. You know, it's a tiny country. I mean, the way it impacts us is a lot of us want to go. And there's been a 36% increase since December 17th, just in the first quarter of 2015, in Americans traveling to Cuba. You know, so I think there's that. I mean, it's an opportunity for us to learn more about another country that we were never able to learn about before. That's great. There are businesses that are engaged. Airbnb is doing business now in Cuba. I traveled with the CEO of JetBlue and MasterCard and some of the other big companies that are engaged in trying to, develop relationships with Cuba so that, not today, but in the future, there will be relationships between them. I guess maybe I won't go on too much more about that because it'll come out more later. But my main point really that I wanted to get to was that I think it's much more important actually to think about how this affects the Cuban people. I mean, it's their country. And policy up until now, the last 55 years, has been policy that's been unilateral. Now, for very good reason, maybe, but it's been an embargo that we've imposed on Cuba. Since December 17th, our policy is based on a negotiation. There is a big difference, and I think there's a big difference in terms of how we evaluate progress and success or failure. I mean, what is this expression, perfect is the enemy of the good? Well, that's certainly true when it comes to negotiating. You'd never get to perfect. And the question, I think, just is how close to good are we going to be able to get? And I think that, given 55 years versus 7 months, it's very hard to kind of reach a verdict about the new policy at this point. But there are some clear examples, I think, of how things have gotten better since December 17th in ways that they didn't move for 55 years before.
Well, that leads me to the.
Can we
unless you wanna-
just keep this conversation going a little bit longer, because I'd like to respond a little bit
sure.
to both of them and just let them, I mean, Otto and I have been discussing this for many years, so in many different settings, and sometimes pleasantly and sometimes less so, but let me just.
So far, it's the former.
All right. I wanted to make 2 points. One, on the just sort of in broad sketches, that, this is probably one of maybe 2 countries in the whole world, Otto, where there's a debate over whether the Obama initiative was positive or not. That most other countries are applauding, particularly in Latin America, etc. They may be wrong. There could be 194, 198, how many? But the fact is, the U.S. on this particular policy issue has really been alone. So, and in fact, when I was thinking about it, I was thinking about saying there's really 2 things: what's going to happen, and whether this was the right decision. And I sort of was going to talk about what's going to happen.
And Peter, you have the UN voting against the embargo every single year.
Yeah, and in any event,
Talking
that's
about the
one.
community of nations.
That's one point. Secondly, Otto, you know,
Some people see that, of course, as a positive sign.
right. One other item, you worked at the United Nations, you know how important that institution
Only I was forced to work.
I'm sorry. The other is the embargo. Let's assume that it did play a role in a positive role in the early stages. You know, there's the question, what have you done for me lately? And the fact is that Cuba is no more democratic today than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So in that sense, if you think the objective, and I think this is what Obama says, this is what Kerry is to improve the human rights situation in Cuba, begin to promote something of an opening toward democracy, beginning to see an economic reform that can raise income levels in Cuba, and I mean, they're so terribly low. One institution that my wife works with, you know, sort of lost 20 people in a budget cutback, and they needed, they were desperate. This was a group that works with intellectually disabled, and they came to, and they said they needed support for 20 staff members. And she said, well, 20 staff members for a year, how much are you talking about? They said $5,000 to give you an, you know, and so, you know, Cuba is way behind. And that's where I sort of part company a little bit with Sarah, in the sense that I think that the relationship with the U.S. plays a crucial role in Cuba, no doubt. But it's the decisions made by the Cubans and the Cuban government. And they have made one bad decision after another over so many years that the Cuban economy is a disaster area. With all the talk about reform and change, Cuba imports $15 billion a year. It exports $5 billion. The hole is filled by Venezuela, remittances and all. You can't run an economy with two currencies, and you can't run an economy that all decisions are decided from the center. You will never get innovation, etc. These are decisions that the Cubans have to make. The opening with the United States give opportunities. The United States is nearby. It's a very powerful, wealthy country. There's lots of opportunity, but it's the Cubans who have to make the decisions. If not, it's going to sort of continue. And just, you know, I mean, Greece was part of Europe. It didn't take advantage of it. Other countries did a better job. It's not easy always to. And I think the problem is not the relationship as much as it is decisions made by the Cubans of where they want to go now.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads me to the next question. When talking about, you know, undoing, you know, Secretary Kerry said we're beginning to undo the harm that's been done and trying to, you know, start from a clean slate. So that leads me to the next question. How do you generate trust? How can these two countries act as neighbors and put aside their ideological differences, or trying to find a middle ground? I wanted to run through some of the main differences right now that are separating the two countries. So for instance, on the Cuba side, Cuba again demanded yesterday that the U.S. lift the embargo, that it returns Guantanamo. As you know, it's being leased by the U.S. So, and the third demand, although the foreign minister insisted that it was not a precondition, but it is a demand, you know, a respect for Cuban sovereignty, meaning no interference from the U.S. in domestic affairs. That's been one of their complaints over many years, that the U.S. has not necessarily been promoting democracy more than just supporting dissidents who want to destabilize the government. So that's been one of their demands as well. On the U.S. side, the U.S. government, of course, is going to, at one point, going to talk about economic reparations for the properties that were confiscated to Americans, the release of political prisoners, the extradition of American fugitives in the island, and of course, respect for human rights and political freedoms. So I pose this question to you. When you have those two separate demands, is there room for a middle ground? Is there a room where the two governments can come to the negotiations and say, okay, this is what we're willing to do in the short term and the long term for the stated goal of full normalization of U.S. and Cuba relations?
I mean, with all due respect, there's been no negotiation. I mean, the negotiations were, you know, I think by definition, where one side gives something and the other side gives something else. If you tell me what the Cuban government gave in exchange for the ability, for example, to have a pep rally at their embassy here yesterday, where, you know, in the capital of the United States, the entire Cuban delegation was yelling "Fidel, Fidel," which is, by the way, what people were yelling as Fidel was executing people in Cuba. And so the Cuban Americans remember that. The United States did not ask for any of those things that you talked about. In the 18 months, allegedly 18 months of negotiations that took place leading up to December 17, the United States did not raise human rights, did not raise property rights, did not raise elections, did not raise freedom of speech, freedom of the press, any of the things that we take for granted here. Peter mentioned that we have to, I think he said something to the effect that these are decisions that the Cubans have to make. For the last 55 years, the only Cubans that have made decisions in Cuba are about 5 people. There is no democracy. You know, I could not, as an American diplomat, I had to negotiate with some very reprehensible people. But you know they're reprehensible. I think that Secretary Kerry lowered the standards of the United States by what he said yesterday, frankly. But of course, you know, I've been thinking that ever since he went to Managua in 1984 and lowered the standards, and Secretary Schultz called him a silly man as a result. So he has a lot of history, a lot of experience in that, in being silly. The problem is that he's now Secretary of State, and he goes around signing treaties. Just signed one treaty in Vienna that 2/3 of the Congress is determined to stop. The administration is looking for the Iran deal, looking for one Democrat to make number 34 to block that deal. Apparently, Republicans are not the only ones. In fact, they're not. And let me correct you, the Republicans are not the only ones that are concerned about the Cuba deal.
I didn't say that. I
I'm
said
sorry,
that some Democrats as well.
Well, okay, I'm glad you said that. I missed it because the
And
chairman
some
of the...
Republicans support opening and negotiations also.
Jeff
Yes,
Flake,
yes.
Carlos Gutierrez.
And yet, exactly, and yet the administration's been losing, it lost 5 consecutive votes so far this year by margins of as much as 120. So it isn't just the Republicans, on Cuba, by the way. And why? For example, talking about business going to Cuba. How many people know? I mean, what Sarah says sounds very nice. How many people know that to do business in Cuba today, and the companies that have been doing business in Cuba in the last 25 years, which, by the way, 25 years, because with the demise of the Soviet Union, Castro was forced to open up the economy. Up until then, he laughed at tourists. He laughed at doing business with the United States. That's all on the record. So the Europeans, for example, the Canadians, they run a hotel in Cuba. You know how they obtain workers? They can't hire a worker. They don't put an ad in the paper and hire a Cuban worker. They go to a Cuban government ministry run by the Castro brothers, and they say, I want a cook, I want a maid, I want a gardener. That ministry then assigns a trusted, usually a member of the Communist Party, because that's how they reward members of the Communist Party, to work in that hotel or factory or mine or whatever it may be. The foreign investor, or there's no investors really, but the foreign entity
Well, there are,
then
just not in
pays.
the US.
Well, let me finish. The foreign entity pays in hard currency to the Cuban government, dollars or Canadian dollars or euros. The Cuban government then turns around and pays that worker in their made-up currency, which is 92 cents, of which 92 cents is kept by the government. The worker gets 8 cents to the dollar. That's a 92-cent confiscation of the hard work of that worker. That has been called virtual slavery by the International Labor Organization. That is the kind of investment that my colleague here on the left wants to, at least my left, wants to promote in Cuba. And I think, and I assure you, the U.S. Congress will never allow that, no matter what party. So this is one of the obstacles. I mean, it's all very nice, the interviews and the press conferences and the flag raising. We're talking about a 55-year military dictatorship with no recognizable freedoms, no freedoms that we recognize. They violate every single freedom that is listed in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights.
But isn't the point of opening to Cuba and then giving Cuba the chance to open up to the U.S., the whole point of that is to actually promote the kind of change that you're talking about,
Right.
Promoting democracy. It's interesting to me with the opposition coming from the GOP and some Democrats, but mainly from the GOP. I'm surprised that, you have the business community, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is going to be pouring billions of dollars to promote this opening.
Billions of dollars?
Not billions, but it's going to spend a lot of money. I'm being told that coming up in the next couple of months, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is going to be investing money in promoting this opening. Why? Because it's a potential for American companies. I was just reading that Cuba imports 80% of its food for a total of $2 billion. That may not be a lot, but it is an opening for American consumers, American producers, American companies, telecommunications companies. There's a bill in Congress that was introduced this week that will open up or expand access to internet in Cuba, giving more chance for creating business opportunities for American telecommunications companies. So I'm wondering, why is it, if the stated goal is to promote change in Cuba by expanding this people-to-people exchanges and expanding business opportunities, isn't the GOP running counter to American business interests that want to do business in Cuba?
Well, maybe. But if American business, let me tell you, some American business, but I'm a businessman. I've started 3 companies, and I know also, by the way, the president was completely wrong when he said if you own a business, you didn't build it, I built it. My father built businesses. So, I mean, that's another thing that proves, I think, that he wasn't quite what we expected. The fact is, in this case, the Chamber of Commerce is wrong, as the Chamber of Commerce was wrong during the Reagan administration, when it opposed the sanctions against the Soviet Union that brought it down. And with all due respect, I don't know if perhaps I didn't understand you correctly when you said something to the effect of just like it worked in the Soviet Union. How many people know that trade and tourism with the Soviet Union peaked in 1980? It was not trade and tourism and cultural exchanges that brought down the Soviet Union. I can tell you what it was because I worked for 8 years in the Reagan administration. It was a policy, a concerted policy of hostility and sanctions. And by the way, the sanctions began under President Carter. The grain embargo, which was opposed by the Chamber of Commerce, the boycott of the Moscow Olympics, which was opposed by the Chamber of Commerce. In 1982, President Reagan, against the objections of the Chamber of Commerce and all the European countries, opposed the building of the Trans-Siberian pipeline that was going to bring gas to Western Europe, because he recognized that when the Russians wanted, they would cut off the gas and blackmail the Europeans. By the way, exactly what Putin is doing now. That pipeline did not happen. It was blocked. The United States was alone. You said, or somebody said we were alone. We have to be proud to be alone when we're the only ones that are preventing another dictatorship from winning. And negotiations by themselves do not bring peace, especially when you give up everything. Ask Mr. Chamberlain. When Chamberlain went to Munich, 4 years later, my grandparents were dead because they were Jewish. And he opened the door for Hitler to do what he did. So we have to be very careful with negotiations, with our desire for peace, and with fooling ourselves. Some people, a lot smarter than I am, are calling the president's policies delusional. And in the case of Cuba, I agree. In the case of Iran, I'm learning a lot about it, and I'm beginning to agree.
But the other argument, of course, and this is why we're here,
Let
sitting
me
here today.
just
the embargo was
ask a
delusional.
few questions, though. I didn't. The point is, first of all, the negotiations between the U.S. and Cuba. You don't have to look at them as a win-lose. They win what we lose, we win what they lose. Presumably, the idea of a negotiation is to bring both people to a better situation than they were before. In other words, and I don't see where the Cubans have gained a whole lot quite yet. The fact that Cuban Americans can send more money to Cuba is not really changing the picture in Cuba. I don't see the sort of opening of making it easier to travel to Cuba, a little bit easier to trade, is giving Cuba very, very much. In other words, neither side has given up very much so far, number one. Number two is that, in fact, that was the whole idea. Now, you may disagree with the Obama, which you obviously do, but it's very hard that precisely that negotiation, talking to people in the White House and the State Department who were engaged in it, was precisely to begin a process of opening to Cuba. That engagement might have more of an impact on Cuba to improve the situation of Cubans than the current embargo did. The idea was to gain access to greater numbers of Cubans, to give Americans more of a chance to go. It may not work. It doesn't work everywhere.
Peter,
But
which is,
certainly-
which is why I brought up,
But
which is why
That's
I
certainly-
not
brought
worked
up.
anywhere. Engagement, name me one country that has been liberated by tourists. Or name me one country that has opened up as a result of engagement.
Well, it depends. I mean, that's
Eastern
not
Europe.
China, for one, is more open today than it was back during Mao Zedong.
Great. Would you want to live in China?
No, but that's,
But
in
that's not
other
what
words,
we're
would you want to
arguing.
live in I don't want to get into that kind of thing.
I would
But-
just like for the record to say that there are some things that we actually got. I'm not saying it's a lot, but I'd like to tell you what they are. Cuba released a CIA agent who was held for 20 years. Cuba released Alan Gross, you probably heard of him. Cuba released 53 of its political prisoners. Yes, many of them they do this catch and release thing where they go out and demonstrate.
You mean
they
they've been
round them up.
rearrested? Right.
And then released,
Right.
and
And
then
they'll-
released again.
Yeah.
Not all of them. Some of these were people who were in for long terms, for decades, and they were released. Cuba agreed to increase internet access. Now, we think that it's like kind of insane that they don't just have internet, but it's a big deal to Cubans that they are increasing internet access, and they really are.
And it's
There's
actually
been a-
reducing by half the price to
That's right,
gain
and there are
access to the internet.
136 new internet cafes, places where people can go other than the university or work to do their own private internet. So this matters. Cuba agreed to visits by the UN Special Rapporteur and the International Red Cross. We have our embassy open now, and the agreement on opening those embassies is that the senior embassy officials have a lot more latitude in terms of getting out and talking to Cubans, getting out across the island and bringing Cubans into the embassy. And, we've already begun face-to-face negotiations with the Cubans on human rights. That's something that we have put as a very top priority. Now, does that mean that there has now been a dramatic change in human rights in Cuba? No. But if you ask me, it's much better to be at the table having a conversation about this than to be, insisting on a perfect Cuba, because it isn't going to happen.
Actually,
I
I'll
also
tell you
want to
that-
say something
yeah.
more, because I feel like maybe what I bring to this conversation is that I really spent a lot of time in Cuba. And we do trips where we have official meetings with the government, but then we have a parallel program that's unofficial, and spent a lot of time in the homes of Cubans, not connected Cubans, not Cubans who were sent to us by officials, but real live Cubans, in their homes, in their places of worship, in their workplaces. And I can tell you, I was there on December 17th. It was, what do you call it? Palpable. It was palpable. I mean, Cubans were so excited about what had just happened. They were thrilled to see their president, Raul Castro, say that he had talked to Barack Obama on the telephone the night before. I mean, this was like incomprehensible to Cubans. And it was, huge. You know, it gave oxygen. I mean, Cuba has a big demographic problem, as we know. You know, there's sort of no future for young people, right? Professionals drive cabs. You know, you can't have control over your own life. So lots of Cubans are leaving the island. The fact that this happened, the fact that Raul Castro said what he did, and that he's now been making these incremental changes and giving them more and more control over their lives is huge for Cuban people. And I guess I just want to, I think it's important to understand, and we may think that they're stupid and wrong and naive and whatever, but Cuban people very much want this to happen.
Sarah, can you bring up, I don't know if you have any updated information, but I've seen a lot of polls, the Florida International University, for instance, for as long as I can remember, and at least in the last decade,
Yeah.
they've been doing this national polls every year about changing attitude, changing demographics in Southern Florida, and changing outlooks and views on what to do about Cuba. How should the U.S. deal with Cuba? And what I have seen is that there has been an increased support, even within the Cuban exile community and the millennials in particular, about trying something new, not lifting the embargo altogether, but trying something new, incremental steps to trying something new. A lot of it has to do with the fact that many of the Cuban Americans were born here, so they have no connection, emotional or political, to the island, even if they have families back there. So that plays into why their views are different from the quote-unquote old guard. So I wanted to see if you've seen any updated information.
National polls since this year, in 2015. And, you know, some of them by companies you never heard of, but they also have been done by Gallup, by Pew, by AP. I mean, you know, very reputable polling firms. And they across the board, 60% or better of American people support lifting the travel ban, support normalizing relations. Now, that just is a fact. I think also interesting is a poll was done on the island by Ben Dixon earlier this year. And it came out in April, and it showed a lot of interesting things, but one, including popularity of Fidel Castro and Barack Obama. But I think most important is that 97% of Cubans said they wanted new relations with the United States, and an opening to the United States.
I think there were real problems with that poll, though.
Well, that
on
may
this.
be.
In
I mean,
other
it's
words,
Cuba.
That it was exactly, and there was real questions about that. Other pollsters had
So,
said that
yeah.
it was
Has
impossible.
anybody here lived in a police state? This is not a humorous question. Anybody here lived in a
Yeah,
police state?
lots of people.
If somebody comes to your door and asks you, how do you feel about anything? Is this a sunny day or a rainy day? Are you going to think about what you're going to tell them?
I would argue you should visit Cuba, because it's amazing what Cubans will say.
You know, I was
Seriously.
born in Cuba. I still have relatives in Cuba. I talk to a lot of people who go in and out of Cuba, and they disagree with you. I mean, but the problem is that the people in Cuba have been under surveillance for 55 years. I mean, if anybody saw The Lives of Others, for example, not enough movies like that. It wasn't about East Germany. The police state in Cuba works so efficiently that people, you know what they say? They say, el policía está en la cabeza. They don't have to see the policeman in the street. They have been watched from elementary school. They have been told what to believe. They've been told to turn in their parents if their parents say something against the government, and sometimes they do. It's just like the Soviet Union. So when people, talk about polls, I remember, a lot of leftists, including the Center for International Policy, back in the Nicaragua
It's not my
case.
Wrong group.
No, that was, you came from the Center for International Policy.
I worked there.
Right. So we're saying that the Sandinistas were very popular. There was a poll right before the election in 1990, which was, by the way, forced by pressure from the United States through the Contras. Otherwise, the Sandinistas would not have had an election. But the poll showed on the eve of the election that Daniel Ortega was going to win by 17%. Daniel Ortega lost by, I believe, 13%. It was a 30-point turnaround. You cannot have a poll in a closed society. People are not going to tell you. When they depend, as they do in Cuba, on the government for the job, you cannot get a job if you don't work for the government. You
Yes,
can
you
be a
can.
cuenta propista, which is these categories that the government has created. You know what one of them is? Forrador de botones. You can cover a button. You can set up a one-man barber shop. Only one man, only one chair. You
That's-
cannot. That's not true?
No.
Oh, okay. Then I'll have to tell all the Cubans who told me that you know better.
Well, I mean, it's not true now.
It's listed.
It's, no,
It's
it
listed.
is-
It's
it is-
154 categories, including one that I love, dandy. You know what a dandy is? A dandy is a guy who gets all dressed up and poses for tourists.
Okay,
These
but
are
let
not.
me-
No,
let
but
me-
wait
let
a
me
second.
ask you-
Wait
let
a
me
second.
ask you
We're
this.
not. We're
Let-
comparing apples and oranges here.
Okay, so
Yeah.
if your assumption is that you can't trust what the Cubans are saying to pollsters or even in the privacy of their homes to Americans visiting them, what about on the U.S. side when you have national polls indicating that American voters want to try something new? Is
I
Congress
didn't
and
say we shouldn't try
government
something new.
is Congress and government to ignore what American voters are
No, I
telling
think
them?
Congress has already made up its mind. Congress has, in fact, for example, introduced legislation which will pass, not allowing the Chamber of Commerce or any other business entity from doing business with a Cuban entity that is controlled by the military or the Interior Ministry. Now, do you want an American company to do business with the Cuban military? Are you going to support financially a military dictatorship? Because that's what that means.
What I had in mind were
You
the
mean
bills.
the way we supported Pinochet?
Well, no, let me tell you. No, as a matter of fact, a lot of people don't know that we actually had an embargo against Pinochet. You should know that.
We're not till very late in the game.
Well, and the same with Batista. You know, I agree. And I mean, the United States did have an embargo against Batista.
But I
Too
guess
late.
what I had in
Yeah,
mind.
I oppose Batista. I wish
guess
that
what I
embargo
had
had
in
come
mind
earlier.
were the 3 or 4 bills that are making its way or that have been introduced on the Hill, where it is reflecting the fact that American voters want to open up to Cuba, not
not
lift the
passing.
embargo. Well,
They're being
that's the.
defeated. 5 votes, though, so far this year, all defeated.
But what I'm saying, no, the bills that are being introduced that haven't had a hearing or a vote, I'm talking about the ones that reflect what American voters are telling their lawmakers on the Hill.
You
We
know
want
what
to try
American
something
voters
new.
are telling the lawmakers on the Hill.
Well, you know, presumably our lawmakers on the Hill are representing the congressional districts, and therefore
But see,
representing what the
you're saying
voters
is
are
we should have
saying.
change. I agree, we should have change. But I think the change we should have is a change that will bring about freedom in Cuba. That's it.
So what would you propose? What would you advise the president to do if what he's pushing forward is not going to work?
Well, I
And
would-
if whatever we've tried for 54
there are-
years hasn't
look,
worked?
There have been many. We have experience. I mean, the United States has. Well, you know what I would do? I'd say, Mr. President, go back and look at National Security Directives number 75, number 77, number 27 from 1991 from President Reagan. Look what he did to bring about the end of the Soviet Union without firing a shot.